In the cold metallic corridors of the distant starship Eclipse, Captain Darian Kane stood face to face with an alien unlike any he'd encountered before. Her skin was a mesmerizing shade of lavender pink, glistening faintly under the dim glow of the ship's overhead lights. Her piercing violet eyes studied him with a mix of curiosity and intensity, and though her expression was calm, there was an unmistakable tension in the air, as if the weight of countless unspoken truths hung between them. Darian's battle-scarred armor reflected the faint blue light of the ship's console behind him, a reminder of the mission that had brought him here, the pursuit of a rogue faction that had stolen one of humanity's most devastating weapons. But now, standing in this claustrophobic hallway with this enigmatic alien, his mission seemed less clear. "You don't know what you've unleashed," she said, her voice a low, melodic whisper, as though it were meant for his ears alone. The other alien, a silent figure who seemed to be her companion or perhaps a bodyguard, lingered a few paces behind, her striking pink visage partially obscured by shadows. The air crackled with the hum of unseen energy, and Darian's pulse quickened, though he wasn't sure if it was the looming threat of violence or something far more primal. He tightened his grip on her hands, not in aggression, but in an attempt to ground himself in the surreal moment. "Tell me what I need to know," he demanded, his tone sharper than he intended. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping further, a conspiratorial edge lacing her words. "It's not the weapon you should fear, Captain. It's who created it." As she spoke, her gaze shifted to the corridor behind him, her expression flickering briefly with what looked like genuine fear. Darian turned instinctively, his hand moving toward the plasma blade at his side, but the hallway was empty. Or so it seemed. A faint sound, like the distant hum of machinery, began to grow louder, and Darian realized it wasn't coming from the ship itself. It was alive, something unseen stalking them, feeding off their fear. When he turned back to the alien, her expression was one of resignation. "You've already doomed us all by coming here," she murmured. Before Darian could reply, the lights flickered and dimmed, plunging the corridor into near darkness. Somewhere deep within the bowels of the ship, a guttural roar echoed, shaking the walls and sending a chill through Darian's very core. Whatever was coming for them wasn't just an enemy, it was a force beyond their comprehension, and it had been waiting for him. Before Darian could process her ominous words, the floor beneath them began to vibrate, and a low, mechanical groan reverberated through the walls. The lavender-skinned alien pulled her hands free from his grasp, her sharp nails grazing against his armored gloves. "It's waking up," she said, her voice now trembling, a stark contrast to the confidence she had displayed moments ago. The silent figure behind her, the other pink-skinned woman, stepped forward with urgency. Her eyes glowed faintly as if charged by some internal energy, and she reached out to touch a nearby control panel. Strange glyphs lit up under her fingers, alien symbols that Darian couldn't decipher but somehow felt familiar, as if they spoke to a buried part of him he didn't understand. "What is waking up?" Darian demanded, stepping closer to the pair, his hand hovering over his plasma blade. The roar from deep within the ship grew louder, resonating through the metallic hull like a living heartbeat. The alien woman turned to him, her expression a mix of frustration and pity. "You've activated it, Captain. By chasing us here, by bringing your kind's weapon into this place. You've called it to you." Her words made little sense, but the sheer conviction in her tone sent a chill racing down Darian's spine. Before he could respond, the corridor ahead of them split open, not in an explosion, but as if the ship itself had been alive and was tearing apart from the inside. Black, viscous tendrils snaked through the gaping wound, gleaming in the flickering light. The air grew thick with an unnatural, suffocating energy, and Darian realized with horror that this was no ordinary enemy. The lavender alien turned to her companion. "We can't stop it here. We have to take him to the Nexus before it's too late." The other woman nodded and extended her hand toward Darian. "Trust us or die here," she said, her voice cold but commanding. Darian hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to fight, to stand his ground. But as the tendrils began to coalesce into something far more massive, their shape twisting into a grotesque, shadowy form with dozens of glowing eyes and jagged, unnatural limbs, he knew he had no choice. He took her hand. The moment he did, a surge of energy coursed through him, and the world around them seemed to dissolve. The ship, the creature, the cold metallic walls, all of it blurred into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Darian's stomach churned as if he were falling through endless space, but when the sensation finally stopped, he found himself standing on a platform of shimmering crystal, surrounded by an infinite expanse of stars. The alien women stood beside him, their expressions grave. "This is the Nexus," the lavender-skinned woman said, her voice echoing strangely in the ethereal space. "It's the only place where we might contain what you've unleashed. But you must understand, Captain, this isn't just about your mission or your people. The weapon you were hunting isn't a thing, it's a fragment of a god. And now it knows you exist." Darian's mind reeled, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He had spent his life fighting wars, defeating enemies he could see and understand. But this was something beyond the scope of human comprehension. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The alien stepped closer, her violet eyes locking with his. "You have to survive. Because if you die, it will take your place, and nothing in this universe will be able to stop it." Before Darian could reply, the stars around them began to pulse with a malevolent red light, and a deep, otherworldly voice boomed through the void. "You cannot run from me, little soldier." The creature had followed them, and it was no longer confined to the ship. Darian tightened his grip on his plasma blade, the weight of the universe bearing down on him. He had become the unwilling key to a war far greater than he'd ever imagined, and there was no turning back now. The crimson light pulsed brighter, flooding the Nexus with a searing, unearthly glow. The alien women flanked Darian, their hands raised as arcs of luminous energy began to ripple from their palms. The lavender-skinned woman, whose presence now seemed more commanding than fragile, whispered words in an ancient tongue that echoed through the crystalline platform. The stars around them dimmed in response as if bending to her will. But the voice, deep and guttural, roared through the void again, shaking the very fabric of the Nexus. "You think this place will save you? It was mine long before it was yours." The swirling red light began to take form, morphing into a massive hulking figure that towered over them. Its body was an amalgamation of shifting shadows and glinting razor-sharp edges, its dozens of glowing eyes fixed on Darian. The sight of it was enough to freeze his blood, but he forced himself to stand his ground, gripping his plasma blade tightly. "Darian," the lavender-skinned alien shouted, snapping him out of his stupor. "The Nexus amplifies will. You're not powerless here." She gestured toward the weapon in his hand, its blade flickering faintly in the strange light. "It's not just a tool of destruction, it's a conduit. If you want to fight it, believe in it." He stared at her, disbelief flashing in his eyes, but there was no time to question her words. The creature lunged, its massive form closing the distance in an instant. Darian raised the blade instinctively, expecting it to be cleaved from his grip, but instead, it flared to life. The blade's glow intensified, burning brighter than any light he had ever seen, and when the creature's claw met it, a shockwave of pure energy exploded outward, sending the beast stumbling back. Darian felt the power coursing through him now, a warmth spreading from the blade into his very veins. "The Nexus amplified will." He repeated her words in his mind, focusing on the only thing that mattered now: survival. The glowing platform beneath them shifted, rearranging itself as though responding to the battle. Crystal spires rose from the surface, channeling streams of light that converged around Darian. The alien women joined in the assault, their hands weaving intricate patterns in the air, each motion releasing bolts of radiant energy that struck the creature with precision. But it wasn't enough. The entity roared in fury, its shadowy limbs regenerating faster than they could destroy them. Its voice boomed again, more insidious this time. "You think you are strong, soldier? You're nothing but a spark in an infinite void." It lashed out, a tendril of darkness slamming into the lavender-skinned alien and throwing her to the ground. Her companion screamed her name, rushing to her side. Darian felt rage boil inside him, hotter than he'd ever known. This wasn't just about him anymore. These strangers, had risked everything to bring him here to fight something he barely understood. He wouldn't let their sacrifice be in vain. He focused all his energy into the blade, willing it to grow, to shine brighter. And it did. The weapon's light expanded, engulfing his entire body, and as he stepped toward the creature, he felt invincible. The entity hesitated, as if sensing the shift in power. "What is this?" It snarled, its form wavering. Darien didn't answer. With a roar of his own, he charged, slashing the blade through the creature's core. The impact was deafening, a collision of light and shadow that sent tremors through the nexus. The beast screamed, its form unraveling into a cascade of black tendrils that dissolved into nothingness. When the light faded, Darien fell to his knees, his chest heaving. The platform around them was silent, the stars calm once more. The lavender-skinned alien staggered to her feet, her companion helping her. She approached Darien, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and awe. "You did it," she said softly, though her tone carried a note of caution. "But this isn't the end." That fragment was only one piece of the whole. Darien looked up at her, his face pale but resolute. "Then we keep fighting," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the battle he had just endured. "Because if we don't, no one else will." The alien nodded, her lips curving into a faint, weary smile. "You might just survive this after all, Captain." And with that, the nexus began to dissolve around them, pulling them back into the fabric of reality where the next battle awaited. As the shimmering nexus faded and reality came rushing back, Darien felt his feet hit solid ground. The cold, familiar steel of the eclipse's floor replaced the crystalline surface of the nexus, but the silence that greeted them was deafening. He gripped the plasma blade tightly, its glow now dim, but the memory of the immense power it had channeled still lingered in his mind. The two aliens, battered but alive, stood beside him. The lavender-skinned woman staggered slightly, her strength visibly waning. Her companion caught her, steadying her before casting a wary glance down the dimly lit corridor. "We're not safe yet," the companion murmured, her voice sharp and low, as if the walls themselves were listening. The ship was eerily quiet, but it wasn't the comforting silence of safety, it was the kind that came before something worse. The air felt heavier, oppressive, as if the remnants of the dark entity's presence still lingered, seeping into every crevice of the ship. Darien stood, his mind racing. "If that was just a fragment, as you said, then where are the others? And how many more of these things are out there?" His voice was steady, but the weight of his question was suffocating. The lavender-skinned woman wiped a smear of glowing ichor from her face, her violet eyes meeting his. "The fragments are scattered across this galaxy and beyond. The one you fought was the weakest. The others," she trailed off, her gaze darkening. "The others are far stronger, far older. They've been dormant for millennia, waiting for something, or someone, to wake them." Darien frowned. "And you think I'm that someone?" "You're connected to them now," she replied grimly. "That blade you carry, that weapon of your kind, it was forged from the same essence that binds them. You're not just a soldier anymore, Captain. You're a tether. They'll follow you wherever you go, and they'll destroy everything in their path to get to you." Her words hit him like a hammer. He had faced death countless times in battle, but this was something entirely different. He wasn't just fighting for his survival anymore, he was fighting for the survival of everyone and everything he had ever known. The ship shuddered violently, pulling them from their thoughts. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the corridors, not unlike the roar of the creature they had just fought. The lavender-skinned woman stiffened. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. "What's here?" Darien demanded, his plasma blade flaring to life. "Not another fragment," her companion answered, her voice cold and grim. "Something worse. A sentinel. It's what the fragments send to test those who awaken them." Before Darien could respond, the ceiling above them ruptured with a deafening crash, and a massive, obsidian-black figure descended into the corridor. Its form was both mechanical and organic, its jagged limbs pulsating with an eerie crimson light. Its head turned toward them, a singular glowing eye focusing on Darien. It didn't speak, but its presence alone conveyed a singular purpose: annihilation. The lavender-skinned woman grabbed Darien's arm. "Run," she hissed. But Darien didn't move. For the first time in his life he wasn't thinking about retreat. He wasn't thinking about tactics or survival. He was thinking about the responsibility that had been thrust upon him, the lives he now carried on his shoulders. "No," he said firmly, raising his blade. "We end this here." The sentinel charged, its massive limbs tearing through the corridor with alarming speed. Darien moved instinctively, dodging its first strike and retaliating with a swing of his blade. The weapon flared brilliantly as it struck the creature, sending sparks flying, but the sentinel barely flinched. The aliens joined the fight, their hands weaving complex patterns in the air as streams of energy lashed out at the sentinel. The battle was chaotic, the narrow corridor barely containing the violence. Sparks flew, walls crumbled, and the air was filled with the sound of metal against metal, energy against flesh. Darien could feel the weight of the blade in his hands growing heavier with each strike, as if it were draining him. The sentinel, relentless and unyielding, showed no signs of weakening. "We can't hold it here," the lavender-skinned woman shouted, her voice strained. "This isn't a fight we can win." Darien knew she was right. The creature wasn't something they could destroy, not yet. But they could still escape. "There's an airlock 2 levels down," he said. "We can jettison it into space." The aliens nodded, and together they began to retreat, fighting their way through the narrow corridors as the sentinel pursued them. Every step was a battle, every moment a test of their resolve. Finally they reached the airlock. Darien turned, his blade raised as the sentinel barreled toward them. "Get the door open," he shouted. The lavender-skinned woman's companion worked quickly, her fingers flying across the control panel. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the void of space beyond. "Now?" Darien roared. With a final desperate strike, he drove the sentinel backward toward the open airlock. The creature resisted, its massive limbs clawing at the walls, but Darien pushed harder, his blade glowing brighter than ever before. With one final shove, the sentinel was flung into the void, its roars silenced as it was swallowed by the darkness. The airlock sealed with a heavy clang, and for a moment, all was silent. Darien collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving, the blade slipping from his grasp. The lavender-skinned woman knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. "This is only the beginning," she said softly. Darien nodded, his eyes fixed on the blade. "Then we'll be ready for what's next." But deep down he knew the fight ahead would test them in ways they could scarcely imagine. And somewhere in the far reaches of the galaxy, the fragments stirred, their collective will growing stronger. The ship hummed with a tense silence after the battle. For a brief moment, Darien allowed himself to breathe, leaning against the cold metal wall. But he knew there was no time to rest, not yet. He glanced at the lavender-skinned woman, her face pale but resolute, and her companion, who was already scanning the control panel for signs of further threats. "What now?" Darien asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion but tinged with determination. The lavender-skinned woman straightened, her violet eyes meeting his. "The fragments aren't just lying dormant. They're waking faster now that the sentinel was dispatched. The Nexus held them at bay for centuries, but your presence, your weapon, it's like a beacon calling to them." She hesitated, her expression troubled. "We need to reach the Origin Forge before they converge. It's the only place where we might sever the connection between you and them." "The Origin Forge?" Darien repeated, narrowing his eyes. He didn't like the sound of it. "And what happens if we don't make it in time?" Her companion turned, her voice sharp. "If we don't, the fragments won't just consume you, they'll consume everything." Before Darien could respond, the ship's alarms blared to life, bathing the corridor in a flashing red glow. The sound was shrill and unforgiving, a warning that sent shivers down his spine. "Incoming," the lavender-skinned woman muttered, her gaze snapping to the nearest viewport. Darien followed her line of sight and felt his stomach drop. Beyond the glass, the void of space was alive with movement. Dozens of shapes emerged from the darkness, ships, but not like any he had ever seen. They were jagged and organic, their hulls pulsing with an ominous crimson light. At their center was a massive vessel, a hulking monstrosity that radiated power. It was a harbinger of destruction, and Darien knew immediately it was here for him. "They're here for the weapon," the lavender-skinned woman said grimly. And they won't stop until they've torn this ship, and you, apart? Darien clenched his fists, his mind racing. Can we outrun them? Her companion shook her head. Not in this rust bucket. They're faster, stronger, and their weapons will tear through us like paper. Then we fight, Darien said firmly, his hand gripping his plasma blade once more. The lavender-skinned woman placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Not here. Not now. The Origin Forge is our only chance. If we die here, everything ends. Darien hesitated. Every fiber of his being told him to stand and fight, to face the enemy head-on. But he knew she was right. This wasn't a battle they could win, not yet. What do we need to do? He asked. The lavender-skinned woman's companion didn't answer. Instead, she moved quickly to the ship's controls, her fingers dancing over the console. The ship groaned in protest as its engines flared to life, the sudden burst of power shaking the entire vessel. I'm setting a course for the forge, she said. But they'll follow us. We'll need to hold them off long enough to get there. Easier said than done, Darien muttered, but there was no fear in his voice, only resolve. The ship lurched forward, its thrusters pushing it to the brink as it sped away from the encroaching fleet. Darien and the lavender-skinned woman moved to the weapons bay, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The corridor was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears and determination. As the first wave of enemy ships closed in, the Eclipse shuddered under their fire. Explosions lit up the viewport, the crimson glow of enemy weapons illuminating the dark void of space. Darien manned one of the ship's turrets, his hand steady as he fired round after round into the oncoming ships. The lavender-skinned woman stood beside him, her hands raised as she channeled bursts of energy that struck the enemy vessels with precision. The battle was relentless. For every ship they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. The Eclipse groaned under the strain, its hull cracking in places as the enemy fire intensified. But they held on, pushing forward with everything they had. Finally, through the chaos, the lavender-skinned woman's companion shouted from the cockpit. We're approaching the forge. Brace yourselves. The view outside the ship shifted, the darkness of space giving way to a massive structure, a towering construct of ancient metal and glowing energy that radiated power. The Origin Forge. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a reminder of the immense forces they were dealing with. The ship hurtled toward the forge, its engine straining as it fought to evade the enemy fleet. As they neared, the forge began to pulse, its glow growing brighter with each passing moment. The lavender-skinned woman turned to Darien, her expression grave. When we enter the forge, everything will change. It will test you in ways you can't imagine. If you fail. I won't fail, Darien interrupted, his voice unwavering. He looked at the forge, its light reflecting in his determined eyes. This ends here. One way or another. As the Eclipse plunged into the forge's glowing core, the world around them dissolved into a blinding light, and Darien felt a pull, a force greater than anything he had ever known, drawing him into the unknown. The final battle had begun. The world dissolved into pure, searing light as the Eclipse entered the Origin Forge. For a brief, terrifying moment, Darien felt weightless, untethered from time and space. His senses were overwhelmed, light burned through his eyelids, a deep, resonant hum vibrated in his chest, and the air itself felt alive, charged with ancient energy. Then, with a shuddering jolt, reality snapped back into place. They stood on an endless expanse of polished obsidian, beneath a swirling sky of shifting colors, crimson, gold, and violet. The forge was alive, its surface pulsating like a heartbeat. Strange towers of shimmering metal rose from the ground, each etched with intricate, glowing runes. The lavender-skinned woman and her companion stood beside Darien, their faces pale with awe and trepidation. We're here, the lavender-skinned woman whispered, her voice reverent but tense. The forge. It's more powerful than I imagined. Before Darien could respond, the ground beneath them began to shift, rippling like liquid. From the horizon, dark shapes emerged, growing larger and more defined with each passing second. They were not the jagged ships of the enemy fleet, they were massive humanoid constructs of shadow and light, their forms flickering as if caught between dimensions. At their center, a colossal figure loomed, its presence suffocating. It was unlike the sentinel they had faced earlier, this being radiated an overwhelming aura of command and malice. "The warden," the lavender-skinned woman said, her voice trembling. "The guardian of the forge. It doesn't care about us. It exists to protect the forge's secrets. If we can't convince it to let us pass, it will destroy us." Darian gritted his teeth, his plasma blade already in his hand. "Convince it? How do we convince something like that?" She shook her head. "It's not words it listens to. The forge tests willpower, resolve, and worthiness. You'll have to face it, Darian. Alone." The warden strode forward, its every step shaking the ground. Its voice, deep and resonant, boomed through the forge, bypassing their ears and speaking directly into their minds. "Who dares awaken the forge?" Darian stepped forward, his grip tightening on the hilt of his blade. "I'm Captain Darian Cross. I've come to sever the connection to the fragments. To end this cycle of destruction." The warden tilted its massive head as though studying him. "You seek to sever what was never meant to be broken. You, a mere mortal, wish to rewrite the laws of creation?" Darian took another step forward. "I don't care what it was meant to be. Those fragments are tearing apart everything. If that means defying the laws of creation, so be it." The warden's voice turned colder. "Then you shall be judged." The ground beneath Darian split apart, swallowing him in a surge of light. He found himself standing in a different realm entirely, an endless void of stars and shifting landscapes. The plasma blade in his hand felt heavier, and he realized this was no ordinary test. This was a battle of will, of soul. Shadows emerged from the void, twisting and writhing into forms that mocked him. Figures from his past, comrades he had failed to save, enemies he had been forced to kill, and even the faces of innocents caught in the crossfire. They spoke, their voices filled with accusation and doubt. "You think you're a hero? You're nothing but a killer. You can't save anyone." Darian's chest tightened, his grip faltering. The blade dimmed, its glow almost extinguished. But then he thought of the lavender-skinned woman and her companion. Of the people on distant worlds who had no idea of the threat looming over them. Of everyone who was counting on him, whether they knew it or not. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his guilt. "I've failed before and I'll fail again. But I'll keep fighting because if I don't, no one else will." The shadows recoiled, their forms disintegrating as the blade's light flared to life. Darian felt the warmth of its energy again, stronger than before. He advanced through the void, every step a declaration of defiance against the doubts that tried to consume him. The warden appeared before him, its colossal form dominating the void. It raised a massive weapon, a blade forged of pure light and shadow, and swung it with devastating force. Darian met the strike head-on, his plasma blade colliding with the warden's weapon in an explosion of energy that sent shockwaves through the void. The battle was unlike anything he had ever faced. Every strike of the warden tested not just his strength but his resolve. It didn't matter how fast or skilled he was. Every time he faltered, every moment of hesitation, the warden grew stronger. But Darian held firm, his determination burning brighter with each clash. Finally, as the warden raised its weapon for a final, crushing blow, Darian focused all his will into his blade. He channeled every ounce of his strength, his hope, and his resolve into a single devastating strike. The blade cut through the warden's weapon, shattering it into fragments of light. The warden staggered, its form flickering and dissolving into the void. When the light faded, Darian was back on the obsidian platform. The lavender-skinned woman and her companion were there, their eyes wide with astonishment. The warden's towering figure knelt before him, its voice softer now. "You have passed the forge's test. The connection shall be severed, but the cost will be great." Darian met the warden's gaze, his expression unyielding. "I'll pay it." The forge began to glow, its energy rising in a crescendo of light and sound. The battle wasn't over, but Darian had taken the first step toward ending it. As the warden dissolved into the light, he knew one thing for certain. The fragments would come for him, but he would be ready. The galaxy's survival depended on it. The light of the forge pulsed brighter, engulfing Darien in its overwhelming brilliance. He braced himself, expecting pain or some sort of transformation, but instead, a calm silence descended. For a moment, everything stopped. The sounds of the battle outside, the hum of the forge, even his own heartbeat. It was as if the universe itself held its breath. Then a voice, ancient and resonant, spoke, not from outside but from within his very soul. You have chosen sacrifice, yet you do not understand its weight. The fragments are bound to you, but severing them will unmake what you are. Do you accept this fate? Darien hesitated. He thought of his crew, the lavender-skinned woman, her companion, and the countless lives hanging in the balance. He thought of all the battles he had fought and the weight of every loss he had endured. If giving up what he was could save them, there was no question. I accept, he said firmly. The forge responded immediately. The obsidian platform beneath his feet cracked, releasing streams of light that spiraled upward. The air around him grew heavy, charged with an energy so ancient it defied comprehension. He felt the fragments within him stir, resisting the pull of the forge's power. They weren't just pieces of a weapon. They were alive and they didn't want to let him go. Suddenly the ground trembled and a deafening roar shook the forge. Darien turned to see the colossal ship from earlier forcing its way into the forge's domain. Its jagged hull scraped against the dimensional barriers, sending arcs of energy spiraling into the void. From its core, a new figure emerged, taller and darker than the warden, its body a shifting mass of molten metal and crimson energy. It was the Arbiter, the fragment's true master, and it had come to claim him. The lavender-skinned woman ran toward him, her eyes wide with desperation. Darien. The Arbiter, if it takes you now, it will merge with the fragments. It will become unstoppable. Darien's mind raced. The forge's power was surging, the connection to the fragments weakening, but if the Arbiter reached him, everything would be lost. He looked at the lavender-skinned woman, her face a mix of fear and hope, and made a decision. Get to the ship, he ordered, his voice firm. You and your friend need to leave. What? No, she protested, grabbing his arm. We fight together. No, he interrupted, his tone final. This fight is mine. If I don't stop the Arbiter here, the galaxy doesn't stand a chance. She hesitated, her violet eyes searching his for any sign of doubt. But she found none. Reluctantly she nodded, her voice trembling. Don't you dare die on me, Darien. As she and her companion ran back to the ship, Darien turned to face the Arbiter. The entity was close now, its molten form radiating an intense heat that made the air shimmer. Its voice echoed, dark and guttural. You cannot resist, mortal. The fragments are mine. You are mine. Darien gripped his blade, the weapon trembling in his hand. The forge's energy flowed through him, a burning torrent that threatened to tear him apart. But he held on, channeling it into the blade until it shone like a star. I'm no one's, he growled, charging toward the Arbiter. The clash was monumental. Every strike of the Arbiter's molten limbs sent shockwaves rippling through the forge, but Darien held his ground. He moved with a speed and precision he didn't know he possessed, each swing of his blade cutting deeper into the Arbiter's shifting form. Yet the entity was relentless, its attacks growing more ferocious with every passing moment. The fragments within him screamed, a cacophony of rage and desperation. They were fighting to stay connected, their power clinging to him like a parasite. Darien pushed forward, ignoring the searing pain that tore through his body. He had to finish this, there was no other way. As the Arbiter raised a massive, molten fist for a final, devastating blow, Darien poured every ounce of his strength into his blade. He leaped into the air, the forge's energy surging through him, and brought the blade down with all his might. The weapon struck the Arbiter's core, releasing a blinding explosion of light and sound. The Arbiter let out a final, earth-shaking roar as its form disintegrated, collapsing into a cascade of molten fragments that dissolved into the void. The forge's light flared one last time, and Darien felt the fragments within him shatter, their connection severed forever. He collapsed to his knees, the blade slipping from his grasp. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning. The forge's voice spoke again, softer now. You have succeeded, but at great cost. What remains of you is yours to decide. Darian's body felt heavy, his strength fading. But he managed a weak smile. The galaxy was safe, and that was enough. The lavender-skinned woman's voice called out to him, distant but growing closer. Darian, hold on. As darkness claimed him, he felt her arms wrap around him, her warmth pulling him back from the brink. For the first time in what felt like forever, Darian let himself rest, knowing he had done what needed to be done. Darian drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in a liminal space between life and death. Voices echoed around him, some familiar, others strange and alien. His body felt weightless, yet every fiber of his being ached. Memories flashed before his eyes, battles fought, comrades lost, and the faces of those he had sworn to protect. But amidst the chaos, one image remained steady, the lavender-skinned woman's eyes, filled with determination and sorrow. When he finally opened his eyes, he was no longer on the forge. He was in the eclipse, lying on a medical cot in the dimly lit infirmary. The hum of the ship's engines was a comforting reminder that he had survived. Barely. About time you woke up. Her voice was soft but laced with relief. He turned his head to see her sitting by his side, her violet eyes glistening. She looked exhausted, her once pristine armor scorched and cracked from the battle. You always have to make things dramatic, don't you? Darian tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his voice came out as a raspy whisper. The forge, the arbiter, is it over? She nodded, though her expression was far from celebratory. The arbiter is gone. The forge severed the fragments. You did it, Darian. You saved us. Her voice faltered and she looked away. But at a cost. He frowned, struggling to sit up. That's when he noticed it, something was missing. The energy that had burned within him since the fragments bonded to him was gone, leaving a hollow void in its place. His body felt weaker, frilier. He clenched his fist and realized his strength, his enhanced reflexes, all of it had vanished. The fragments were tied to your very being, she explained as if reading his thoughts. When they were severed, they didn't just take their power. They took a part of you. Darian let out a slow breath, trying to process the weight of her words. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the forge. But if that was the price for saving the galaxy, he would pay it 1,000 times over. Where are we now? He asked, shifting the subject. Her companion entered the room then, her tone curt but respectful. We're en route to the Arctis belt. There's a neutral station there where we can lay low and make repairs. The enemy fleet scattered after the forge's energy surge. Whatever you did, it sent a shockwave that disabled their systems. But they won't stay down for long. Darian nodded, his mind already moving forward. Even without the fragments, the galaxy was far from safe. There would always be threats, always battles to fight. And though he was no longer the superhuman warrior the fragments had made him, he still had his resolve. You'll need rest, the lavender-skinned woman said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The fight isn't over, Darian. But you don't have to face it alone. He met her gaze, her words sinking deep into his heart. For so long, he had fought as though the weight of the universe rested solely on his shoulders. But now, as he looked at her and the companion who had stood by him through it all, he realized he wasn't alone. He never had been. The eclipse hummed softly, a ship battered but unbroken, much like its captain. Darian lay back, allowing himself a moment of peace. The forge had tested him, broken him, and reshaped him. He wasn't sure what kind of man he would become in the aftermath, but one thing was certain. As long as there was a galaxy to protect, he would fight. No matter the cost.